Calvin Morrow's hands shook as he signed the final paper, the pen scratching louder than the auctioneer's gavel. It wasn't excitement. It was the weight of disbelief. A man who couldn't make last month's rent had just bought a lighthouse no one wanted. The crowd behind him snickered, the laughter cutting through the salt-thick air like gull cries. Someone muttered, "He'll sink before the tide does." Calvin caught it, but he didn't turn. He just folded the deed carefully, as if gentleness might turn it into something real. Inside him, something small and battered said this had to mean more than failure. It had to. The Mariner's Point lighthouse rose crooked against the horizon, its paint flaking like shed skin. The roof leaned, the glass top shattered in places. But to Calvin it still stood straighter than he did some days. He'd driven past it for years on his way to the docks, always watching it fade, like a man afraid to look too long at what he might become. Now it was his responsibility, his gamble. A teenager filming from the fence snorted, "Look at him, Captain Rustbucket." The boy's phone caught Calvin's bent posture, the wind tugging at his thrift store jacket. The video would hit the town's feed before Calvin even reached his truck. He knew how that would play out. The comments, the jokes, the pity disguised as advice. He could almost hear them already. Morrow's lost it. Should have stayed on unemployment. Calvin shoved the deed into the glove compartment and sat there for a long time, staring at his own reflection in the cracked windshield. It wasn't the lighthouse that scared him. It was how much he needed it to work. For Noah. For something left to fix when so much else was gone. The docks had closed, the bills kept coming, and the silence at home had started to sound permanent. He imagined Noah's face when he told him, 10 years old, small shoulders set like a grown man's. "We're gonna rebuild it, bud," he rehearsed under his breath. "Make it shine again." He wanted to believe it out loud before he said it to his son. Calvin climbed out of the truck and stood at the edge of the bluff. The wind smelled like iron and wet rope. Down below, waves slammed the rocks, restless and unforgiving. He understood them. He'd been slamming against something unseen for years, hoping to stay above the surface. Maybe this tower, this broken stack of steel and salt, could give him something to climb instead of something to fight. A gull screamed overhead, and the sound felt like a challenge. Calvin nodded once toward the lighthouse, the decision already done. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's start." He didn't know that the town would watch every move, or that the videos mocking him would rack up thousands of views. All he knew was that the tide was coming in, and he had a promise to keep. If you felt what Calvin's feeling, starting over when no one believes you, subscribe and stay with us. The next part of his story is just beginning. The horizon was still more gray than gold when Calvin parked the truck by the bluff. Noah rubbed his eyes and squinted toward the water. "This it?" he asked. The boy's voice was thick with sleep and doubt. The lighthouse stood against the paling sky, half its railing missing, rust streaking the tower like old tears. The wind smelled of salt and decay. Calvin watched his son take it in, waiting for the question he knew would come. "Dad," Noah said, "why'd you buy something that's falling apart?" Calvin smiled, though it hurt to. "Because no one else would," he said, "and I think maybe that's reason enough." They walked the narrow path down to the base. Every step crunched on shells and broken glass. Noah carried a small thermos. Calvin carried a hammer. The door loomed ahead, flaking in strips of red paint. He reached for the handle, and it came off in his hand. For a moment, Noah laughed, a sound too rare lately. Calvin laughed too, letting it happen. Inside, dust motes drifted through shafts of weak light. The air was cool and smelled like iron and rain. Noah tilted his head back, following the spiral stairs as they vanished into darkness. "Feels like it's breathing," he said. Calvin looked up too and could almost hear it, the low groan of metal, the whisper of the tide below. "It's been waiting a long time," Calvin said. They climbed halfway before the steps bent under their weight. "Careful," Calvin warned. He placed his hand against the wall, steadying himself. "You see? This tower's got bones." Old but strong, Noah traced a finger over the wall's pitted surface. You really think we can fix it? I don't think, Calvin said. I know. He knelt, resting both hands on the rusted railing. But it's not just about fixing it. It's about finishing something that's supposed to guide people home. Outside, the first light of morning brushed the sea. The waves turned silver, the sky softening to pale blue. Calvin and Noah stepped back out into the cold air. The boy shivered and jammed his hands into his jacket pockets. Calvin crouched down to meet his eyes. By the end of summer, this light's going to shine again, he said. That's our deal. You help me, we see it through. No matter what people say. Noah hesitated. The gulls cried overhead, the sound sharp and lonely. Then he stuck out his hand. Deal, he said. Calvin took it. Their handshake was small and quick, but it steadied something inside him that had been drifting for years. The wind lifted, carrying the smell of brine and iron through the air. As they walked back to the truck, Noah turned once more toward the leaning tower. It's ugly, he said. Calvin smiled. Then we've got work to do. The morning sun broke over the horizon, spilling light across the cracked glass at the top. For the first time, Calvin thought he saw it flicker. The stack of envelopes sat on the kitchen table like a dare. Calvin turned them over one by one, power, rent, insurance, then set them aside without opening them. He didn't need to see the numbers to know what they said. The truck's brakes had been grinding for 2 weeks. The grocery list was shorter every time, and Noah's teacher had sent home a reminder about the field trip deposit due Friday. The morning light pushed through the thin curtains, catching the worn edges of the bills, turning them pale and honest. Noah sat across from him, chewing cereal that had gone soft in the bowl. You going to the docks today? He asked. Calvin shook his head. No work down there anymore. I got a porch repair job over on Miller's Road. Should cover groceries for a bit. Noah nodded, eyes on the table. He'd learned not to ask how much a bit meant. Calvin watched him finish breakfast and shove his books into his backpack. Bus money's in the jar, he said. Noah hesitated before taking it, knowing it was supposed to be for gas. After the bus rumbled away, Calvin went out to the truck. The brake pedal sank almost to the floor. He pumped it twice, listening to the grinding metal, and muttered, "Hold together one more week." The air smelled of salt and diesel. A seagull landed on the hood and cocked its head, as if mocking the idea. By noon he was hammering loose boards on a stranger's porch, sweat running down his back. He worked fast, careful, stretching each job into the next. Between nails, his mind ran inventory. How much paint the lighthouse needed, how far the grocery money could go, whether the tire patch kit would survive another trip to the bluff. May's old sedan pulled up beside the curb. She leaned out, holding a paper bag. "Brought you lunch before you forget to eat again," she said. He smiled, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Appreciate it, May. Didn't think you took pity on fools." "I don't," she said. "I take care of people who work harder than they should." She left before he could answer, and inside the bag he found a sandwich, an apple, and a folded note that said, "Keep steady. The tide always turns." He tucked it into his wallet beside the crumpled lighthouse deed. That evening, back home, Noah sat on the floor sketching the lighthouse from memory. "We should paint it white again," he said. "White takes more coats," Calvin replied, though the idea made him smile. "We'll see what we can afford." The phone buzzed, another overdue notice. He silenced it. "Eat up, kid," he said softly. "Tomorrow we start on the stairs." Outside, the truck cooled with a metallic tick, and the wind from the shore slipped through the cracked window. The bills still waited on the table, patient as the tide, but for now Calvin let them wait. He had promises to keep, and daylight was already running short. The wind that afternoon came hard off the sea, driving grit into every seam of the old lighthouse. Calvin steadied the ladder against the wall, paintbrush clenched between his teeth as he tightened the last bolt on the frame. The tower leaned a little more than usual, creaking in protest. From the road above, the sound of laughter drifted down. "Hey, Morrow," someone called. "You sure that thing's not about to swim away?" Calvin looked up to see 3 teenagers by the fence, phones held high. One zoomed in on the tower, another mimed it tipping over. The third shouted, "Careful, your retirement plan's listing to port." Their laughter cut through the wind like broken glass. He didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that quiet was stronger than anger. Still, the flush rose in his neck as he climbed down. The gust caught the tower again, and the old steel ribs groaned. The boys whooped. One yelled, "Look, it's dancing!" Noah had been hauling a pail of scrap nails near the door. He froze, eyes on the hill. The wind pressed his shirt flat against his chest. "They're filming," he muttered. "I see them," Calvin said evenly. He reached for another length of rope, pretending to be busy. "Let them." Noah's jaw tightened. "They're going to post it." "Then let them post it," Calvin said, looping the rope around a beam. "That camera can't see what we're fixing." The boys stayed a few minutes longer, shouting a few more jokes before driving off, their laughter fading into the hum of the highway. Calvin watched the dust settle, then exhaled slowly. "You all right?" "Yeah," Noah said, though the word came thin. He kicked at a pebble. "They think it's funny." "People always laugh when they don't understand what something's for," Calvin said. "Doesn't change the work." That night, the video hit the local feed. Someone had titled it Morrow's Folly and looped the moment when the tower swayed in the wind. It spread fast. Likes, laughing emojis, captions calling it the next tourist hazard. At school the next day, Noah heard it whispered in the hallways. "Hey, Lighthouse boy," one kid teased as he passed. "Your dad selling tickets to the collapse yet?" Another held up a phone showing the clip. "You gonna live stream it when it falls?" Noah tried to laugh with them, the sound brittle in his throat. He said nothing, just shrugged and walked away. But that night, when Calvin found him sketching by the window, the boy's pencil marks pressed too hard, lines digging into the paper. "They think it's gonna fall," Noah said quietly. Calvin sat beside him, picking up the bent eraser. "Then we'll just have to show them what standing looks like," he said. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the glass. Noah looked toward the dark shape of the lighthouse against the sky. "It's still there," he murmured. Calvin smiled faintly. "And it will be tomorrow, too." The hardware store on Main Street still smelled of pine dust and machine oil, the same as it had when Calvin worked there years ago. He pushed his cart slowly down the aisle, loading it with bolts, epoxy, and scrap brackets. Small things that didn't look like much but meant progress. The hum of the overhead lights mixed with the murmur of Saturday customers. He reached the counter just as Earl Denton walked in, talking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, if it isn't the Lighthouse man himself," Earl said, grinning wide. His shirt was crisp, his boots spotless. He looked around theatrically. "You fixing or finishing your monument to stubbornness today?" Calvin set his items on the counter without looking up. "Just picking up what I can afford," he said. Earl leaned on the display, voice dripping with amusement. "You know, I drove past that tower yesterday. Saw those braces you bolted on. Looks like you built them out of firewood and prayers. You really think that's going to hold?" A couple of customers chuckled. The cashier hesitated mid-scan, caught between professionalism and curiosity. Calvin's jaw tightened, but his tone stayed even. "It's holding fine." Earl picked up one of the brackets from the pile and turned it over in his hands. "You'd get twice the strength with proper steel supports. Of course, that'd cost real money." He set it down with a clank. "Guess the town'll save itself the trouble when it folds over before fall." Calvin met his eyes, calm but tired. "It's not folding." Earl smirked. "I'd bet on gravity over sentiment any day." The silence stretched until May, who'd been in line behind them with a bag of seeds, spoke up. "Funny thing about gravity," she said. "It only wins when you stop building against it." Her tone was mild, but her gaze sharp enough to make Earl step back half an inch. Calvin gave her a quiet nod of thanks, paid for his supplies, and carried the box out to his truck. The laughter inside followed him to the door, fading under the rumble of passing cars. Outside, Noah sat in the passenger seat, swinging his legs. "He giving you trouble again?" Calvin set the box in the bed and climbed in. "Just opinions. Everyone's got one. Noah looked out the window toward the water. He doesn't get it. Calvin started the engine, staring down the long stretch of road leading to the bluff. Doesn't have to, he said. We're not building it for him. They drove in silence for a while, the sea appearing through the windshield, gray and endless. The lighthouse stood ahead, bent but stubborn, catching the last of the afternoon light. Noah pointed. Still standing. Calvin nodded, his voice low. And it will be when fall comes, too. As they pulled into the gravel lot, the wind pressed against the truck, rattling the doors. Calvin smiled faintly at the sound. It was the same wind that tested everything, the same wind that proved what could endure. The meeting room smelled faintly of mildew and burnt coffee. Calvin sat at the long table, his hat resting on his knee, while the council members shuffled papers that didn't seem to matter much. A ceiling fan clicked overhead. He could feel every eye on him, waiting for him to blink first. Councilman Pierce, the one with the neatly parted hair and the real estate smile, leaned forward. Mr. Morrow, our concern isn't your enthusiasm. It's safety. You're operating heavy equipment without verified structural clearance. Calvin nodded once. I'm not using heavy equipment. Just hand tools and a winch. The structure's stable enough for what I'm doing. Pierce tapped his pen. Stable? The tower's leaning 8 degrees off-center, according to last year's inspection. And you've got your 10-year-old down there with you? Calvin kept his voice steady. He's not on the scaffolding. He helps clean, that's all. A few murmurs rippled through the room. The clerk typed noisily at her laptop, as if punctuating each pause. Calvin could feel the weight of what they were really saying. You don't belong doing this. May sat in the back row, quiet but watching. Her small nod every so often reminded him to breathe. Pierce sighed and shuffled his papers again. Look, nobody's against restoration. We just can't have liability issues. You don't carry site insurance, and from what I gather, your safety plan is informal. Calvin frowned. My plan's to make sure no one gets hurt. That's as formal as it gets. The councilwoman beside him, Mrs. Cutter, a retired banker with too much perfume, leaned in. That may sound noble, Mr. Morrow, but it's not policy. We're issuing a temporary stop work order until a licensed contractor reviews your foundation and signs off. The words dropped like an anchor. Calvin felt heat rise in his chest, but he didn't let it show. That'll cost me money I don't have, he said quietly. Pierce offered a shrug that looked almost sympathetic. Then you'll need to pause until you do. It's about public safety, not punishment. Calvin stood, taking his hat. You ever fix something you didn't own, just because no one else would? He asked. The silence that followed told him everything. That's what this is. He turned to leave, but May caught his sleeve at the door. You handled it right, she whispered. Don't let them make you small. Outside, the air felt cleaner. The late afternoon sun hit the courthouse steps, and the wind carried the faint sound of gulls from the harbor. Calvin put on his hat and looked down Main Street, where the lighthouse just barely showed through the haze. A stop work order wasn't the end. It was just another tide to wait out. He'd find a way around it, maybe through Jonas, maybe through persistence. Either way, the tower would stand again. Temporary, Calvin muttered to himself, heading for the truck. Everything in this town's temporary, except the sea. The wind carried a faint sting of salt as Calvin worked the scraper along the lower wall. Rust peeled away in slow curls, revealing pitted metal beneath. Each drag of the blade sounded like a sigh. Noah sat cross-legged a few feet away, prying up loose planks with the back of a hammer. They'd been at it since morning, and the tide was creeping closer, licking at the rocks below. Feels like we're cleaning bones, Noah said. Calvin paused to look at him. You saying I bought a corpse? Noah smirked. Just saying it's old, like really old. Old doesn't mean dead, Calvin said, pushing his scraper harder until it screeched. Sometimes it just needs someone to notice it's still here. The boy didn't answer. He leaned closer to the floor, tapping at the exposed wood. A faint hollow sound echoed beneath the plank, deeper than it should have been. Dad, he said, tapping again. You hear that? Calvin straightened. Hear what? This! Noah hit the spot with the hammer handle. Thunk. Not the dull thud of solid wood, something sharper, hollow, metal. Calvin crouched beside him, running his fingers over the surface. The plank looked the same as the rest, splintered, swollen from years of sea spray. But under Noah's palm, the vibration was different. He scraped away the grime, revealing a smooth, cold strip just wide enough to catch the light. "That's steel," Calvin said quietly. Noah grinned. "Told you it sounded weird." They worked side by side, pulling up the surrounding boards. Underneath lay a seamless plate, flush with the floor, its edges sealed tight with decades of corrosion. Calvin rapped it with the scraper handle. The sound rang deep, hollow, like a drum buried in the earth. "Could be part of the foundation," he said, though the words felt thin. Foundations didn't ring like that. Noah was already crouched lower, eyes wide. "It's a door, isn't it? Like a hatch or something?" Calvin ran his thumb along the faint groove that traced the plate's outline. "If it is, it hasn't been opened in a long time." The tide hit the rocks louder now, the sea surging against the cliff. Calvin checked his watch, 30 minutes before water reached the base. "We'll come back tomorrow," he said, "but no buts. We don't know how deep that thing goes, and I'm not letting the ocean trap us in here." Noah looked disappointed but obeyed, brushing dust from his knees. He glanced once more at the plate as they stepped outside. The sun had slipped behind clouds, and the air had gone cool. Calvin locked the lighthouse door and turned to see Noah still staring back. "We'll check it when the tide's right," he said. "Promise?" Calvin nodded. "Promise." As they climbed the path, a gust of wind swept across the rocks, and from inside the lighthouse came a low metallic echo, one that didn't sound like the sea at all. By mid-morning, the smell of salt and paint had settled into everything they owned. Calvin leaned over the stair rail, sanding the last riser, while Noah brushed away dust from the treads below. The rhythm of their work filled the tower, scrape, brush, breath, steady as the tide outside. "Feels like it's breathing again," Noah said, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. Calvin looked down at him and smiled faintly. "That's because we are." The tower's just keeping pace. The lower steps gleamed under a fresh coat of gray primer. It wasn't pretty, not yet, but it held. For the first time, Calvin could walk from the ground floor to the first landing without hearing the wood complain. He tapped a beam with the handle of his hammer, listening to the solid thud. "Stronger already," he said. A car horn sounded from the road above. May's old sedan rolled to a stop beside the fence, and she stepped out, holding a pair of steaming thermoses. Her hat blew sideways in the wind, but she laughed, catching it just in time. "I brought fuel," she called. Calvin met her halfway, taking the cups with a grateful nod. "You didn't have to." "Of course I did," she said, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Men who forget to eat forget why they're working." Noah grinned. "She's got you there." Inside, May settled herself on an overturned bucket while they drank. The wind outside whistled through the open panes, and somewhere above a chain clinked softly against metal. "My father used to keep a lighthouse ledger," she said, watching the light filter through the gaps. "Not this one, but another up the coast. Every day he wrote the same line. Light steady, tide fair. Even when storms came, he'd write it anyway. Said it made the weather behave." Calvin smiled, the warmth of the coffee grounding him. "Maybe we should start writing that somewhere around here." "Maybe you already are," May replied, nodding at the half-rebuilt stairs. The afternoon stretched into a blur of movement and grit. Noah brushed paint along the baseboards, while Calvin sealed cracks with filler. They spoke little, just the language of shared effort, short instructions, quiet approval. When Noah's brush slipped, leaving a streak on the wall, Calvin didn't scold, he just handed him a rag. "Try again." Steady this time. By sunset, the lower level had changed. The rust smell had faded under paint and salt air. The stairs stood whole, each step a mark of progress they could see and touch. Noah tested the first few carefully, his weight creaking the boards but holding firm. "Feels different," he said. Calvin nodded, setting his tools aside. "Because we did it right." May clapped softly. "Told you. The tide's turning." They stepped outside as the sun sank, casting the lighthouse in warm gold. The sea stretched endless and quiet. Calvin rested a hand on the railing, feeling the rough metal beneath his palm. For once, it didn't feel like ruin, it felt like something beginning to remember itself. Calvin's reflection wavered across the curved glass of the lantern room as he wiped another circle clear. The salt film resisted at first, then surrendered to the rag, revealing fractured prisms that bent the afternoon light into faint rainbows. Noah stood beside him on the narrow catwalk, turning the replacement bulb carefully in his hands like it might shatter from a wrong word. "Looks better already," Noah said. "Looks cleaner," Calvin corrected gently. "Better comes later." He set the rag down and leaned against the railing. From up here the sea stretched silver and restless. Every window pane framed a different piece of motion. The wind pressed against them, testing for weakness. They'd spent 3 days climbing and scrubbing, their arms and backs stiff from the strain. The rust flakes had turned their clothes orange. Now the lens shone again, fragile but proud, a thing that had survived storms by simply waiting. Calvin knelt at the base of the lamp carriage and twisted the old bearings. They groaned, then rolled with surprising ease. "She turns again," he said half to himself. He gave the gear a careful spin, and the carriage rotated in a slow, graceful sweep. The glass caught the sunlight and threw it in a thin line across the interior wall. Noah watched it move. "It's like it wants to work." "It does," Calvin said. "It's built to." When the bulb clicked into place, they stepped back. Calvin flipped the breaker they'd rewired that morning. The faint hum of current rose, the smell of ozone mixing with sea air. But the light stayed dark. Noah frowned. "Maybe it needs another bulb." "That's the third one," Calvin said. He crouched again, checking the contacts, tracing the wires Jonas had helped him replace. Everything looked right. Tight, clean, careful. Still nothing. He leaned back on his heels, letting the silence settle. The disappointment was quiet, like a slow leak instead of a burst. Noah shifted beside him. "You said better comes later." Calvin smiled a little. "Later just ain't now." They tried again. Breaker off, breaker on, twist, wait. The same dark lens stared back at them. Finally Calvin stood, brushing dust from his knees. "It'll come," he said, though he wasn't sure who needed to hear it more. May's voice floated up the stairwell. "You two planning to sleep up there, or just talking the light on?" Calvin laughed. "Almost done." She climbed to the landing, breathless but smiling. "You've made it shine without it shining," she said, looking at the clear glass around them. Noah pointed at the motionless bulb. "It still won't light." May touched the railing, gazing through the brightened panes. "Maybe it's waiting to see if you mean it." Calvin looked back at the lens, the ocean reflected across its face. For the first time the lighthouse looked alive, even without its glow. The air smelled of clean metal and tide. He placed a hand on the frame. "Then we'll keep showing up," he said quietly, "until it does." By the time the sun began to drop, the wind had shifted. It came off the water colder now, steady and low, sliding through the cracks of the lantern room like a voice that had been quiet too long. Calvin stood near the lens, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, rechecking every connection Jonas had helped him map out. The copper wires gleamed faintly, clean as veins under skin. Noah leaned against the wall, tracing dust lines on the floor with his boot. "You think it's dead?" he asked. Calvin didn't answer right away. "Things built to last don't die easy," he said finally. "They just forget how to work for a while." Outside, the horizon bled gold into violet. The tower creaked in rhythm with the gusts, each sound familiar now, like the breath of something waking. Calvin wiped his palms on a rag, then reached for the lever that engaged the carriage. He gave it a gentle push. The gears hesitated, then caught. The lamp began its slow turn, metal grinding, then smoothing out into a patient hum. The light still didn't come, but the movement alone felt like progress. Noah stepped closer to the window. "It's spinning again." "Yeah," Calvin said softly. "That's a start." They watched the mechanism circle once, then twice. On the third rotation, the wind outside struck just right, rattling the vanes and sending a faint tremor through the structure. The prisms caught the dying sunlight and bent it, scattering it through the glass, until for an instant the room glowed. A thin band of light swept across the wall, weak but alive. "Dad!" Noah shouted. "It lit up!" Calvin turned fast, heart knocking against his ribs. The glow wavered, flickered like a memory, then dimmed again. But he'd seen it too, the faint shimmer, the suggestion of current hiding somewhere in the old bones of the tower. He moved to the base, running his hand along the conduit. "The wiring's still carrying charge," he said. "It's faint, but it's there." Noah crouched beside him. "So, we can fix it?" Calvin smiled, a small, tired curve that reached his eyes this time. "We don't fix what's not broken, son. We just remind it how to shine." They stood in the quiet that followed, the lens still rotating, the light refusing to show again, but leaving behind the certainty that it could. The sound of the sea below deepened as the tide came in, waves folding over each other like slow applause. From the stairwell, May's voice floated upward. "You two still fighting the dark up there?" Calvin laughed under his breath. "Not fighting," he called back. "Just waiting our turn." Noah pressed a hand against the glass, eyes reflecting the last traces of daylight. "It tried," he whispered. Calvin looked past him to the horizon, where the sun slipped clean into the water. "So did we," he said, "and that's how it starts." The knock came just as Calvin finished patching a crack in the base wall. He wiped his hands on a rag, squinting against the glare outside. A white SUV idled near the path, the kind that didn't belong on this side of town. Out stepped Earl Denton, slick jacket, polished boots, a smile that had never known sea air. He walked toward the lighthouse like a man inspecting a problem someone else would fix. "Morning," Earl said, voice easy, practiced. "Heard about the work you've been doing out here. Mind if I take a look?" Calvin nodded once, keeping his distance. "It's public land till you cross that gate. After that, it's mine." Earl chuckled. "Fair enough. You've got grit, Morrow. I'll give you that." He circled the tower, tapping a rusted beam with his knuckle. "Shame, though. I've seen these places go down in a single storm. Romantic, sure, but not practical." Noah appeared from inside, paint-smeared brush still in hand. "It's not going down," he said. Earl glanced at him, amused. "You helping your dad save the world?" "Just this part," Noah answered. Calvin's jaw tightened. "You said you came to look. You've looked. What's next?" Earl smiled wider. "Actually, I came to offer you something, before this beauty costs you more than pride. 20,000. I take it off your hands. You walk away clear. No debts, no busted trucks, no wasted weekends chasing ghosts." Calvin studied the man's face, then the envelope in his hand. The number echoed in his head. 20,000 could fix the truck, pay the rent, buy a few months of breathing room. He glanced at Noah, who stood watching, paint flecked on his cheek, eyes wide but steady. "You really think it's worth that much?" Calvin asked. Earl shrugged. "Not to me. To the land. It's the view I'm buying, not the scrap. You'd be doing yourself a favor. Trust me." The gulls wheeled above, crying into the wind. Calvin ran his thumb over the rough handle of his hammer. "Thing is," he said slowly, "you can't buy what you don't understand." Earl raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning this isn't scrap. It's work. It's purpose." Calvin stepped closer, his voice low but even. "And that's worth more than what you've got in that envelope." Earl sighed, stuffing the paper back into his coat. "You'll change your mind when it caves in. Some things aren't meant to be saved." Calvin met his gaze. "Then I guess we'll find out which kind of thing this is." Earl gave Noah a polite nod before turning toward the SUV. The engine started, humming smooth against the uneven sound of the surf. When the car disappeared over the ridge, Noah looked up at his father. "That was a lot of money," he said quietly. Calvin nodded. "Yeah, but some things are only expensive when you give them away." They stood together in the wind, the lighthouse behind them groaning like it agreed. Jonas showed up without calling first, as he always did, his old pickup rattling to a stop near the bluff. He climbed out slow, toolbox in hand, cigarette tucked behind his ear. "Heard you've been shocking yourself for fun again," he said. Calvin smiled faintly. "Figured you'd hear sooner or later." "I always do." Jonas glanced up at the lighthouse, squinting. "She's looking steadier. Still leans, though, like a sailor too stubborn to sit down." "She's earned it," Calvin said. Jonas grunted in approval and shouldered the toolbox. "Show me what you've got." Inside, the air carried the smell of metal and brine. The wiring Calvin had replaced ran clean along the wall, but the rest of it, old conduit twisting through the stone, looked like something built in a hurry and forgotten just as fast. Jonas crouched beside the junction box, tapping the casing with his wrench. "This isn't standard harbor spec," he said. "Too heavy for lamp current, too deep for storm cable." Calvin crouched beside him. "You think it ran to backup power?" Jonas followed the conduit with his flashlight. "Maybe. Or something else. See here?" He pointed to a faint rust trail that curved down into the footing. "This line disappears under the foundation. Not a feed up to the lamp. This one runs out." Toward the tide, Calvin frowned. Why would they run power away from the light? "That's what I'm wondering." Jonas leaned closer, scraping at the wall until flakes of paint and salt fell away. The metal underneath was stamped with faint numbers and the ghost of a symbol, a circle with 3 bars radiating outward. "This is Coast Guard issue, but modified." Somebody added extra conduit long after construction. They followed the line along the base until it vanished behind a support beam near the floor. The air grew cooler there, damp with the scent of the tide below. Jonas rapped the beam with his knuckles. A hollow echo came back. "There's something under us," he said. "Could be a chamber, could be a sealed run." Hard to tell without opening it up. Calvin wiped his hands on his jeans. Could that explain why the light flickered the other night? Like it caught current from somewhere old? "Wouldn't surprise me," Jonas said. "These old systems were built redundant, 2 feeds, maybe even a hidden generator for wartime use. But I've never seen one routed under the cliff." He shut the toolbox, the sound echoing through the space. "You've got yourself an odd bit of history here, Cal. Strange design. Strange how?" Jonas gave a half smile. "Strange as in, someone wanted it to stay working long after they were gone." They stood in silence a moment, the waves pounding below. The air seemed to hum faintly, like the tower remembered its own pulse. Jonas slung the toolbox over his shoulder. "If you're smart, you'll chase that conduit next low tide. Might be something worth finding." Calvin nodded. "Yeah, feels like it's been waiting," Jonas grinned. "So don't keep it waiting too long." By the end of the week, Calvin couldn't walk into town without feeling the shift. Conversations stopped when he passed. Heads tilted toward him, then away. At the diner, 2 fishermen sat in his usual booth and spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "He's got that kid working on a condemned tower," one said. "Someone ought to step in before it turns ugly." The other grunted in agreement, stirring his coffee. "Fool's pride. Can't build a future out of rust." Calvin ordered his coffee to go. May was waiting by the truck outside, a paper bag in her arms. "It's getting loud, isn't it?" she asked. He nodded. "Earl's stirring it up. Says I'm putting Noah in danger." May sighed. "He's not saying it loud, just to the right people. That's how reputations sink in a small town." Calvin took the bag, sandwiches probably, and set it on the passenger seat. "They can talk. I've got work to do." But as he drove back toward the bluff, he noticed how the stares followed him, people at gas pumps, on porches, pretending not to watch. He felt it like a weight behind his ribs. The lighthouse came into view through the fog, tall and quiet, the metal scaffolding clinging to it like a brace on a broken limb. Noah was already there, crouched near the base, sorting brushes. "You were gone long," he said. "Town was busy." Noah looked up, sensing more than he should have. "They still think we're wasting time, huh?" Calvin forced a smile. "Let them think what they want." "We'll show them." He knelt beside his son, tightening a bolt on the support beam. The sea wind whipped past them, sharp and restless. Later that afternoon, Jonas arrived carrying a bundle of wires. "Heard the chatter," he said, setting the bundle down. Half the docs think you're one good gust away from a lawsuit. Calvin smirked. That's optimism. They used to think we'd fall before lunch. Jonas's eyes narrowed. They're talking about the kid, Cal. Not the metal. Calvin's hands stilled. The sound of the tide filled the space between them. Noah's careful, he said. I know that. But rumors don't run on truth. You might want to keep him home a bit, Noah, standing by the stair, hurt enough to bristle. I'm fine, he said. I'm not scared. Calvin turned, his expression softening. No one said you were, buddy. Jonas gathered his things and gave a short nod. Just keep your head low. Let the work talk. As dusk settled, Calvin stood at the railing, watching the water shift from silver to black. The town lights blinked in the distance, warm, safe, turned away from him. He could almost hear their doubts in the wind. Noah came up beside him. We're still gonna finish, right? Calvin rested a hand on his shoulder. We finish what we start. That's the rule behind them. The lighthouse creaked in the gathering dark, holding its ground like it always had. The morning began clear and still, the kind of calm that usually meant trouble later. Calvin climbed the narrow stairs with a coil of cable slung over his shoulder, humming under his breath. The air smelled faintly of metal and tide. When he reached the landing, something felt off. The toolbox that always sat under the window was half open, its contents scattered across the floor. He crouched, counting by habit. The wrenches were there, the tape, the hammer, but the heavy cutters and the spare leads were gone. A thin black wire dangled from the base of the junction box, sliced clean through. He touched the end. The cut was too neat to be age or rust. "Noah!" he called down the stairwell. His son appeared a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah? Did you move my tools last night?" Noah shook his head. "I didn't touch anything after we packed up." Calvin stared at the wire again. He could hear the waves against the rocks below, steady as breathing. Someone had been here. Not wind, not where. Intent. The realization settled cold in his chest. He tried to keep his voice even. "All right. Go grab me the spool from the truck. We'll fix it." When Noah left, Calvin crouched again, inspecting the box. The break was surgical, snipped just enough to shut down the circuit, but not enough to draw attention. Whoever did it knew what they were cutting. He thought of Earl, of the rumors spreading through town, of the people saying the lighthouse was unsafe. This was their proof, made by someone's hand. Noah came running back, breath quick. "Got it." "Good. Let's make it right." They worked in silence. Calvin stripped the new wire, twisted the ends together, and taped the joint tight. He taught Noah how to test the current with a small light, showing him how patience mattered more than speed. When the faint hum returned, he exhaled. "See that," he said. "Things break. We fix them. That's what we do." Noah looked uneasy. "You think someone did that on purpose?" Calvin hesitated, then smiled just enough to ease him. "Could have been the wind." Salt does strange things to metal. The lie sat heavy, but he let it stay. He didn't want Noah looking over his shoulder every time a car slowed by the bluff. They spent the afternoon checking the rest of the wiring, keeping close. Every sound outside, the crunch of gravel, the cry of a gull, made Calvin glance toward the door. When May stopped by with sandwiches, he didn't mention the missing tools. He just thanked her, forced a grin, and sent her home before dusk. As the sun lowered, he locked every door, every latch. Noah stood beside him, quiet but alert. "We coming back tomorrow?" he asked. "Yeah," Calvin said, pocketing the key. "But we stick together now. All day, every step." He looked up at the dark tower against the fading light. Someone wanted it silent. He wasn't about to let them win. Sunday morning came gray and windless, the kind of quiet that made the ocean sound closer than it was. Calvin hadn't planned to go into town, but May had insisted he meet Pastor Henry for coffee. "He's not coming to scold you," she'd said. "He just worries." Calvin didn't need another person worrying on his behalf, but he went anyway. The pastor waited at a corner table in the diner, sleeves rolled up, Bible closed beside his cup. He was a broad man with a tired kindness in his eyes. When Calvin sat, Henry offered a nod. "Good to see you, son. Heard you've been keeping busy up there." Busy's one word for it, Calvin said. He stirred his coffee but didn't drink. Guess you've heard the rest too. Henry's smile thinned. You know how folks get. They talk when they don't understand something. I figured I'd come to you straight instead of joining the gossip. Calvin leaned back. Then shoot straight. Henry folded his hands. It's not about faith in what you're doing. It's about cost. Every time I pass that bluff, I see you and that boy climbing a tower that could give way any day. I worry that what started as purpose might have turned into pride. The words landed gently, but they landed hard. Calvin took a slow breath. You think I'm too stubborn to quit? I think maybe you're carrying more than the lighthouse on your back. Henry's voice softened. Sometimes letting go isn't failure. Sometimes it's just trust. Calvin looked out the diner window. The sea was a pale smear beyond the rooftops. You ever fix something because you needed to prove it wasn't beyond saving? Henry's mouth curved. Every sermon I've ever written. He let the silence breathe before continuing. But I also learned you can't rebuild everything alone. Even faith needs a scaffold. Calvin ran a thumb along the rim of his mug. I'm not alone. I've got Noah, May, Jonas when he can spare time. And the tower. She's holding. She's stronger than she looks. Henry nodded slowly. Then promise me you'll keep an ear open, that's all. Pride sounds a lot like conviction until it breaks something. Calvin gave a small nod. I hear you. When they parted, Henry pressed a folded napkin into his hand. On it was a verse scribbled in pen. Do not grow weary in doing good, for at the right time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Calvin read it twice before tucking it into his pocket. Back at the lighthouse, Noah was sanding the doorframe. How was coffee? He asked. Calvin smiled. Hot and honest. They worked through the afternoon, the rhythm of brushes and wind filling the silence. As dusk came on, Calvin paused to look out over the water. The words on that napkin echoed in his head, not as warning, but as promise. He bowed his head slightly, murmured a quiet thank you, and went back to work. The moon hung low over the water that night, a pale coin balanced on the horizon. Calvin stood outside the lighthouse, the wind tugging at his sleeves, and let the salt air settle in his lungs. The storm scars along the base still showed, cracked plaster, bent braces, patches of new paint that hadn't yet learned the color of the old. It wasn't enough. Not yet. He rubbed his palms together, the grit of work still under his nails, and whispered the promise out loud just to hear it take shape. By the next full moon, he said, this light turns again. The words carried out to sea and vanished, but he felt steadier for saying them. Inside, Noah was asleep on a pile of old blankets, a flashlight resting beside his arm. They'd been coming here before and after school, packing meals, staying until the wind forced them home. May called it obsession. Jonas called it purpose. Calvin didn't know which was right, only that stopping wasn't an option anymore. He climbed the stairwell, hand trailing the rail, feeling the small give in each repaired step. Every board told a story of something fixed with patience instead of money. At the top, the lantern room waited, silent and dark. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the cleared glass, the clean wiring, the faint hum from the restored bearings. You've come this far, he murmured. You can finish the rest. When dawn began to gray the sky, he wrote out a plan in his notebook. A simple list, scrawled in pencil: reinforce the base, seal the hatch seam, rewire upper circuits, test light by full moon. He circled the last line twice. The date gave the promise shape, something to row toward when everything else wanted to drift. Later that morning, Noah showed up, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. You're already working? He asked. Planning, Calvin said. He handed him the notebook. Think we can make this happen? Noah scanned the list. That's a lot. Calvin smiled. So are we. They started at first light, the two of them moving in quiet rhythm, scraping, bracing, measuring the tower's lean. The sound of their work mingled with the sea, steady and honest. May stopped by around noon with sandwiches, and a look that said she'd heard about the new deadline. You chasing the moon now? She teased. Calvin shrugged. Gives us something to measure by. Well, she said, handing him the bag, Make sure it doesn't chase you back." As the day faded, Calvin watched the horizon again. The sky deepened to indigo, the waves flashing silver in the moonlight. He thought of the people still whispering that he was wasting time, that the tower was too far gone. Maybe they were right, but faith, he'd learned, wasn't about odds. It was about showing up anyway. He turned back to the door, the glow of the lantern room behind him faint but waiting. "By the full moon," he said again, quieter this time, "we make it shine." The morning fog rolled in thick, softening the edges of the shoreline. Calvin crouched near the base of the lighthouse, with Jonas's weathered notebook spread open beside him. The pages smelled faintly of oil and seawater, filled with scribbles that only half made sense. Numbers, arrows, half-faded sketches of conduit routes. He traced one with a calloused finger, following the line that disappeared beneath the word foundation. Jonas had warned him the wiring ran deeper than it should, maybe even outside the original frame. The old Coast Guard boys built redundant systems, he'd said, backup power buried under the tide line, never used after the 50s. Calvin hadn't thought much of it then, but the faint flicker they'd seen in the lens, the one that had refused to die, had changed everything. Noah knelt beside him, holding a flashlight, even though it was broad daylight. "So, what are we looking for exactly?" "Pattern," Calvin said. "Every mark tells you where the current used to live. Salt stains, rust lines, anything that repeats." He tapped the metal wall lightly with the butt of his wrench, listening. The sound shifted from dull to hollow halfway around the base. He tapped again, slower this time. Hollow, solid, hollow. "There," he said. "You hear that?" Noah nodded, leaning closer. "It's like the sound changes right at the corner." Calvin knelt and brushed at the edge where the concrete met the rock. The gray was darker there, crusted with old salt. When he scraped it with the wrench, a faint groove appeared, thin, deliberate. "This isn't damage," he said quietly. "It's a seam." He followed it, inch by inch, until the line disappeared under a rusted anchor bracket near the outer steps. The path slanted toward the cliff's edge, ending above a tide pool that churned below. The realization clicked all at once. "They ran a conduit through the rock," he murmured, "probably a secondary feed to power the lamp during storms." Noah's eyes widened. "You think it still works?" Calvin smiled faintly. "If any part of it does, we'll find out." They spent the afternoon mapping the route with chalk, marking every change in sound along the wall. The fog lifted by degrees, revealing the slow pulse of waves below. Each time the water hit the rocks, Calvin felt the vibration through his knees. "That's where it ends," he said, pointing to the pool. "It runs under us." "Can we get to it?" Noah asked. "Not yet. We'll need a pump and a dry window when the tide drops." As they packed up, Calvin stood for a moment at the edge of the bluff, looking down at the swirling water. The plan in his head was messy, uncertain, but it was something to follow, a path drawn from sound and instinct. He wiped his hands and looked at Noah. "Tomorrow we dig around that base, carefully. If that conduit's still alive, we're one step closer." The boy grinned. "Closer to light?" Calvin nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. "Closer to proof." The sky turned fast, shifting from gray to steel in a matter of minutes. Calvin had been crouched near the base, tracing the chalk lines they'd drawn the day before, when the first gust hit hard enough to sting his eyes with salt. He looked up to see the sea darkening, waves rising and folding into each other like something alive. "Noah," he called, voice cutting through the wind. "Pack it up. We're done for today." Noah glanced toward the horizon, where rain streaked the distance like smoke. "It's coming in quick." "Yeah," Calvin said, grabbing the tarp they'd used to cover the tool crates. "Help me close the lower door." The wind doubled before they reached it. The old hinges wailed, and spray burst through the cracks. They shoved the door shut and dropped the beam across the frame, but water still forced itself in at the bottom, seeping between the stones. Calvin knelt, pressing his hand to the floor. Cold, rising. He ran for the sandbags, stacked by the wall, hauling two at a time. Noah followed, dragging one that looked twice his size. "Line them here," Calvin said, pointing to the threshold. "Keep the corner tight." The next wave struck harder. The whole tower shuddered, a deep groan echoing through its frame. Dust sifted down from the stairs above. "She's holding," Calvin muttered, mostly to convince himself. Noah's voice was small but steady. "What if it doesn't?" Calvin tied off another brace, his knuckles raw. "Then we make her hold." The tide slammed again, water pushing up against the bags, spilling through the gaps. The smell of salt and rust filled the room. Calvin grabbed the last timber from the pile and wedged it between the floor and the door beam. The sound of it locking in place was a comfort. Solid. Final. For a moment, the storm seemed to test them, hammering harder, searching for weakness. Then the rhythm shifted. The wind howled, but the structure steadied. The pressure at the door eased slightly. Calvin leaned against the wall, breath coming slow and rough. Noah crouched beside him, hair plastered to his forehead. "It's not leaking anymore." Calvin nodded, chest tight with relief. "That's because we got ahead of it." They waited as thunder rolled overhead, low and distant now. The rain came next, heavy but less angry, washing the salt from the air. Through a crack in the upper stairwell, Calvin could see a sliver of light returning beyond the clouds. "You okay?" he asked. Noah nodded. "Yeah." Scared for a second, Calvin smiled faintly. Being scared just means you're paying attention. When the sea finally began to pull back, they stepped outside. The rocks gleamed slick and dark, foam clinging to their edges. Calvin stared at the horizon, where the storm had already begun to fade into the distance. He exhaled slowly, the wind cooling the sweat on his face. "We're still standing," he said. Noah grinned. "So is she." The lighthouse loomed behind them, battered but upright, its silence proud, its shape unbroken. The tide had fallen so far back that morning that the rocks at the base of the bluff looked like a new landscape. Pools of trapped water shimmered between barnacles, reflecting the pale sky. Calvin led the way down the narrow path, his boots slipping on seaweed. Noah followed close, carrying a flashlight, though the sun was already bright. "This is as low as it gets," Calvin said, scanning the exposed stones. "If there's anything down here worth seeing, this is our window." They crouched near the foundation where the concrete met raw rock. The previous week's storm had scoured away layers of sand and moss, revealing surfaces that hadn't seen light in decades. Calvin brushed his hand over the edge and felt something smooth under the rough grit. "There," he murmured. Noah knelt beside him. "What is it?" Calvin scraped away more debris until a small metal plate emerged, corroded but still legible. The faint outline of stamped letters caught the light. He rinsed it with seawater, the salt stinging his scraped fingers. "U.S. Coast Guard property," he read aloud. Below it a sequence of numbers, CG 5819A. He ran his thumb over the engraving. This was part of their asset registry. Means whatever's under here wasn't just support structure. It was sealed intentionally. Noah tilted the flashlight toward a faint line that ran from the edge of the plate along the footing. "That seam doesn't look natural." Calvin leaned closer. The groove was straight, precise, about an inch wide, and welded shut along its length. He tapped it lightly with the end of his wrench. The sound was metallic, hollow beneath the surface. He felt a shiver of recognition. "This matches Jonas's notes. The backup conduit, the one they buried under the tide line." Noah grinned. "So there's a chamber under there?" "Could be." Calvin stood, scanning the area. The seam curved around in a partial arc before vanishing into the concrete. If it's sealed, it's for a reason. Whatever they used to power the beacon might have been stored down there. Noah knelt again, tracing the line with his fingertip. "Can we open it?" "Not yet," Calvin said. "We don't know what pressure's behind it or how deep it goes. We'll need tools, a pump, maybe Jonas's help." He took a step back, looking at the exposed footing. The morning light caught the plate just right, glinting once before fading as clouds rolled in. "This proves it wasn't just a rumor," he said quietly. "The tower had a second system, a whole piece of history buried under our feet." The tide began to stir again, lapping higher along the rocks. Calvin wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded toward the path. Time to move. She'll cover it back up soon. Noah glanced at the plate one last time, reluctant to leave. It's not going anywhere, right? Calvin smiled. No, it's waited 60 years. It'll wait one more night. They climbed the path as the sea rolled back in, waves curling over the hidden seam until only foam remained. The lighthouse loomed above them, silent and knowing, as if guarding its secret just a little longer. The morning after the tide revealed the plate, Calvin worked along the shore, collecting driftwood, thick, smooth pieces that the storm had stripped from docks up the coast. His hands were raw from salt and rope, his back stiff, but the rhythm of the work steadied him. Each plank he carried back to the bluff felt like a quiet answer to the laughter that had followed him for months. Noah watched from the steps above, sorting nails into an old coffee tin. "You really think those scraps'll hold?" he called. "They're not scraps," Calvin said, shifting another beam onto his shoulder. "They've already been through worse than this." "That makes them ready." A gull screeched overhead. Farther down the beach, two young tourists set up a camera on a tripod, one holding a small mic, while the other framed the lighthouse against the horizon. Calvin didn't pay them much mind. People stopped for pictures all the time. What caught their lens, though, wasn't the view. It was him. He worked without noticing the focus following him, the way he balanced each board, tied it off with knots quick and sure, the quiet nod he gave Noah when the boy handed him another rope. The camera caught the texture of sweat and grit, the scrape of labor that came without complaint. May arrived mid-morning, a thermos in hand. "You're turning into part of the scenery," she said, watching him drag another beam into place. "Good," Calvin answered. "Maybe folks'll start seeing it instead of mocking it." She smiled faintly. "Give it time." The tide turns faster than gossip sometimes. By afternoon the dock's skeleton had shape again. Calvin stood back, arms crossed, studying it like a man who could almost believe in miracles made from wood and wire. Noah filmed a short clip on his phone, just for fun, a time-lapse of the repair from sunrise to sunset. May laughed softly. "Careful," she said. "Someone might mistake you for an optimist." The next day, the video appeared online, not Noah's, but the tourists'. They'd posted it with the caption, "Single dad restoring an abandoned lighthouse by hand, kind of beautiful." The footage spread faster than either of them knew. By evening, people in town were watching. The same teenagers who'd filmed Morrow's Folly now reposted the new clip, writing things like, "Didn't know he was still at it," and "Guys actually fixing the coast." At the diner, Henry showed May the video on his phone, shaking his head in quiet awe. "Look at him," May said. "All he ever did was keep working." Up on the bluff, unaware of the sudden attention, Calvin and Noah sat on the steps of the lighthouse eating sandwiches. The sea glimmered calm again, the repaired dock steady under the lowering sun. "Think people'll ever stop calling it broken?" Noah asked. Calvin looked out across the water, a small smile forming. "Doesn't matter what they call it, long as it stands." The wind picked up just enough to turn the weather vane above them, the soft metallic sound carrying over the waves like a quiet kind of applause. The small harbor office smelled of dust and brine, the kind of place where history clung to everything. Jonas sat hunched over the microfilm reader, its green glow flickering against his weathered face. Calvin stood beside him, arms crossed, watching rows of faded type roll past on the screen. Maintenance logs, inspection notes, long-forgotten entries written in neat military shorthand. "There," Jonas said, tapping the page as it scrolled into view. "Station 14B, Mariner's Point, decommissioned August 12, 1958. Calvin leaned closer. The record listed standard closures, personnel transfers, dismantled equipment, electrical disconnects. Then one line stopped him cold. "Secondary vault sealed. Contents unclaimed. Status restricted." Jonas sat back, whistling low. "That's not something you see every day." Most of these places were stripped bare before they turned the keys over. "Restricted?" Calvin asked. "Means the Coast Guard logged it, but nobody ever filed a claim. Could have been wartime gear, maybe bonds, maybe nothing, but whatever it was, it's still down there." Calvin felt his pulse quicken. So it's real. The sealed compartment we found. It matches. Jonas nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, the service number too. CG 5819A, right? Same tag. They welded those plates onto anything they meant to lock for good. The hum of the reader filled the silence. Calvin ran a hand over his face, trying to steady the swirl of thoughts. You think they left it because it was dangerous? Could be. Jonas's tone softened. Could also be that they just forgot. Paperwork got buried. Command changed. Tide rolled in. History's full of what people meant to come back for. They printed the page and folded it carefully. The official stamp, decommissioned and sealed by order of Commander H.L. Bishop, looked brittle but undeniable. Back outside, the afternoon sun broke through the harbor mist. Calvin squinted toward the horizon, where the lighthouse stood faint against the sky. No one's touched that vault in 60 years, he said quietly. Feels like it's been waiting. Jonas adjusted his cap. If you're thinking about opening it, wait for the right conditions. You'll need more than courage, need gear, permits, maybe a safety check. Calvin gave a small smile. You offering to help? Jonas shrugged. I'm too old to dive, but I'll run the circuits. Somebody's got to make sure you don't fry yourself when you go poking at ghosts. They walked down the dock, the wood creaking beneath their boots. A couple of fishermen nodded in passing, the first friendly faces Calvin had seen in weeks. Word about the video was still circling. Now whispers were turning into curiosity instead of ridicule. Funny, Calvin said. Took 60 years for someone to notice what they left behind. Jonas grinned. Some lights don't go out. They just wait for somebody stubborn enough to flip the switch again. Calvin looked toward the sea, the folded record paper in his hand. For the first time, the mystery didn't feel like burden. It felt like calling. The tide chart on Jonas's wall had said the low would hit just after dawn. Calvin and Noah were already at the bluff when the sky turned from black to gray, the sea pulling back farther than either had ever seen. Rocks glistened like wet glass, and the foundation of the lighthouse stood higher than it had in 60 years. Calvin gripped the rope coil over his shoulder. This is it, he said quietly. Nodded, eyes wide but steady. They moved down the narrow path, the wind cold enough to sting. The sound of retreating waves echoed off the cliffs, hollow and rhythmic, like the breath of something waking. At the base, the seam they'd found weeks earlier was fully exposed. The Coast Guard plate gleamed dull under a film of salt. Calvin knelt, running his gloved hand along the welded edge. Still tight, he murmured, but the metal's soft from age. Noah handed him the chisel and hammer. Think it'll open? Only one way to find out. He struck carefully at first, small blows, deliberate. The clang of metal on metal carried across the rocks. A faint line of rust dust spilled from the groove. He adjusted the chisel, hit harder. The weld cracked once, then again, a sharp pop cutting through the wind. Noah leaned in, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Keep it steady, Calvin said. We're close. After 20 minutes of work, the seam split enough to pry a corner loose. A thin hiss of trapped air escaped. Calvin wedged his crowbar beneath the lip and heaved. The plate lifted slow, grating against the frame until it fell open with a heavy sigh. Beneath it yawned a narrow shaft, leading down into darkness. Smells like old metal, Noah whispered. Help me with the light. They descended together, boots clanging on the iron rungs. The air grew cooler, drier. At the bottom waited a chamber no larger than a shed, dry as bone despite the sea overhead. Dust motes hung in the beam of the flashlight. Against the far wall stood 3 steel safes, their paint flaking but intact. Each bore the same insignia, U.S. Maritime Salvage Division, 1943. Calvin approached the first safe. Its latch was rusted but not locked. He twisted hard. The handle gave with a groan, and the door swung open. Inside, stacks of sealed crates sat wrapped in oilcloth, stamped with faded ink. Bonds. Maritime Reserve. He tore one open carefully. Inside lay neat bundles of paper, crisp and yellowed, their printed numbers still visible. Treasury bonds, he said, disbelief roughening his voice. God, there's millions here. Noah's breath caught. How much? Calvin looked around the chamber. 3 safes, all full. More than anyone's counted in decades. He rested a hand on the cold metal, awe and weight pressing down at once. This isn't just money, he said quietly. It's a story that never got finished. Noah looked up at him, light reflecting in his eyes. So what do we do now? Calvin glanced toward the shaft above, where sunlight spilled faintly down through the opening. We bring it back to light, he said. All of it. By the time the Coast Guard arrived, the tide had already swallowed the hatch again. Calvin stood beside the lighthouse, clothes still damp from the climb out, watching the officials unload equipment from their truck. Noah hovered close, excitement barely contained beneath the quiet. Jonas and May waited near the fence, both steady as anchors in the commotion. The officer in charge, a woman with sunburned cheeks and a clipped voice, approached, clipboard in hand. Mr. Morrow, you were the one who located the sealed chamber? Yes, ma'am, Calvin said. Found the plate during low tide. The vault was dry. 3 safes inside. She exchanged a look with her partner. You didn't tamper with the contents? Just opened one, he said, to see what it was. The officers disappeared into the structure, returning an hour later with sealed crates stacked in plastic bins. Wartime bonds, the woman said, shaking her head. Issued in 43, never redeemed, face value $68 million. Jonas let out a low whistle. May crossed herself quietly. Noah's eyes darted to his father, searching his face for reaction. Calvin just nodded, the number landing heavy but not changing much of anything inside him. So, what happens now? He asked. Department of Maritime Claims will process ownership, she said. Given the property rights and salvage laws, you'll be entitled to a significant portion. It'll take time, but this is life-changing. Calvin looked toward the lighthouse, sunlight catching the fresh paint on the repaired stairs. That money came from the sea, he said. Seems right it should go back to it. The officer frowned, unsure. Meaning? Meaning the lighthouse gets finished, Calvin said. We'll restore it fully. Training space, emergency center for storms, something that helps the coast stay alive. Noah stepped closer. And maybe a workshop, right? For kids to learn fixing stuff? Calvin smiled at that. Yeah, that too. Jonas cleared his throat. You sure about this, Cal? You could set yourself up for good, Calvin turned to him. Setting myself up was what got me nowhere before. This is something bigger. If it wasn't meant to stay buried, then maybe it was meant to serve again. The officer made a note on her clipboard but didn't argue. I'll make sure your intentions are recorded, she said. Can't promise the process will be quick. That's fine, Calvin replied. I'm used to slow. When the trucks finally left, the bluff grew quiet again. The gulls returned, circling lazy above the surf. Calvin sat on the step beside Noah, who was still staring at the spot where the hatch had been. Dad? The boy asked. You're not mad about giving it away? Calvin shook his head. We didn't find treasure, kid. We found a reason. The tide hissed against the rocks, as if agreeing. Behind them, the lighthouse stood bright in the late light, unfinished still, but no longer forgotten. By the time the first summer fog rolled in, the lighthouse had changed shape again, no longer a ruin, not yet a landmark, but something alive in between. Fresh paint gleamed along the railings, and new wiring hummed softly behind the walls. A handmade sign at the path read, Mariners Point Workshop and Maritime Museum, all welcome. Calvin stood outside early that morning, coffee steaming in his hand as a van of local teens pulled up. They filed out slowly, eyes wide, unsure what to expect. Some carried tool belts, others just carried their phones, ready to document everything. Jonas waited by the dock, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. Phones in your pockets, he called. Hands free. You'll need all 10 fingers today. The kids laughed nervously, but they listened. Calvin smiled. Jonas had a way of turning discipline into invitation. Inside, May arranged thermoses and a tray of sandwiches near the entry table. They'll forget to eat if you don't remind them, she told Calvin. Same way you used to. He chuckled. Still do, some days. As the teens spread out through the tower, the sound of activity filled the air. Hammers, saws, soft voices asking questions. One boy stood beside the old lens, tracing its edge. This thing really used to light ships? He asked. Calvin nodded. Still can. You just have to feed it the right kind of care. May led another group to the lower level, showing them how the wiring channels worked. She spoke like a teacher again, steady, patient, every sentence carrying a quiet respect for the work. It's not just about fixing, she said. It's about noticing what time and weather tried to hide. Jonas took the older students down to the dock, teaching them to splice rope and tie off a mooring. Good knots don't panic, he said. They hold because they trust their shape. The kids laughed, but a few nodded, the metaphor landing deeper than he meant it to. By afternoon, the air buzzed with energy. Calvin moved between groups, helping with measurements and checking safety lines. Every sound, the scrape of sandpaper, the squeak of hinges, the slap of waves against stone, felt like a hymn of purpose. When Noah arrived after school, he slipped easily into the rhythm, showing a younger kid how to brace a step before hammering. Calvin watched him for a while, pride catching in his throat. The boy who once doubted the tower now taught others how to keep it standing. May found Calvin near the door as the sun began to fall. You realize you've built more than a workshop, don't you? She asked. He looked out at the kids cleaning up, Jonas joking with them by the dock. I just built what I needed to see, he said. The horizon glowed faintly pink, the tide coming in gentle. The lighthouse light turned slow and steady above them, catching the evening fog like a promise kept. The work wasn't over, but for the first time it was shared. The first Saturday of the month dawned clear, the kind of morning that made even the sea seem rested. Calvin arrived early, expecting another quiet workday, only to find a truck already parked near the bluff. A handful of men stood by the gate, faces he recognized from town, some from the same crowd that used to laugh when the tower swayed. Earl Denton was there too, dressed down in work boots instead of his usual pressed jacket. He lifted a hand, awkward but genuine. Morning, Cal, Calvin blinked. Didn't expect company. Guess we didn't expect to be here, Earl said. But we saw the new plan, museum, workshop, all that. Figured we owed you some help. My company's donating paint sprayers and a few pallets of lumber. No strings. Calvin studied him a moment, unsure whether to trust the gesture. Earl must have seen the hesitation because he added quieter. You were right about purpose. I was just late catching on. May arrived soon after, balancing a box of sandwiches and thermoses. Looks like we've got ourselves a crew, she said with a smile. By mid-morning, the bluff buzzed with activity. The same teenagers who once filmed Morrow's Folly were now scraping old paint under May's direction. Jonas supervised a pair of volunteers setting up scaffolding, his voice gruff but steady. If it leans, you lean with it. Don't fight it, just balance. Calvin moved among them, showing where to patch the masonry and how to brace against the wind. Every sound, the scrape of metal, the whir of sanders, the rhythm of brushes, blended with the waves below. It was the sound of a place being rewritten. During a break, Noah passed around water bottles and laughed with the other kids. One of the older boys, the same one who'd once shouted from the fence, shook his head. Didn't think it'd stand this long, he admitted. Noah grinned. That's the thing about standing. It's quiet work. Calvin caught the exchange from a distance and felt something uncoil in his chest. For months he'd carried the weight of being the man everyone doubted. Now the doubt itself was doing the lifting. Earl approached again near noon, wiping paint from his hands. The machinery will be here tomorrow. Backhoe, generator, few lights for the path. He hesitated. No plaque, no press. Just figured the place deserved proper footing. Calvin nodded. Appreciate it. Truly. They stood in silence for a moment, both looking out at the sea. The water was calm, the kind of calm that made the horizon look infinite. May called from the door. Lunch break. Nobody works hungry on my watch. Everyone gathered on the grass. The lighthouse casting its shadow long over them. Conversations drifted between bites of sandwiches, plans for gardens, walkways, benches. For the first time, the bluff felt less like a forgotten edge of town and more like its heart. As the afternoon light turned soft, Calvin stepped back to look at the tower. Fresh paint, new braces, laughter rising where mockery once lived. He smiled, quiet and grateful. The work was still hard, but now it was shared. The workshop was quiet that evening, the last traces of sunset glowing through the high windows. Calvin sat at the desk by the wall, the same place where he used to sketch repair notes and supply lists. Now the tools were put away, the floor swept clean, and a single lamp cast a soft circle of light across a blank sheet of paper. He turned the pen in his hand for a long time before writing the first words. To the Coastal Preservation Board, and to everyone who gave their time, hands, or heart to this work, thank you. He paused, staring at the sentence. Simple. Honest. That felt right. He continued slowly, the words forming like pieces of lumber being set into place. When I first stood at the base of Mariner's Point Lighthouse, it looked like a mistake. Too far gone, too dangerous, too lonely to matter. People said it was foolish to try. Maybe they were right then. But what none of us saw at the start was that this tower wasn't waiting for a single hand. It was waiting for a community to remember itself. He leaned back, listening to the wind outside. The sound of the waves against the rocks was softer now, steady instead of angry. Every board, every beam, every coat of paint on this place carries more than labor. It carries voices. The old electrician who showed me where to listen for current. The teacher who brought soup and stories when the weather turned. The kids who sanded the rails until their arms ached. The men who once laughed from the fence and came back with paint sprayers instead of jokes. This wasn't my work. It was ours. Calvin set the pen down and rubbed his temple. The phrase work of "we" came to mind, something May had said during one of the long repair days. He wrote it down. The work of "we" turned a broken tower into a living thing again. We didn't just rebuild it. We realigned it with purpose. This light will shine for fishermen heading home, for teachers walking the bluff at dawn, for the kids who learned that old things can be made new when people care enough to keep showing up. He signed his name, then hesitated, adding one last line beneath it. P.S. The next generation already has its keeper. My son Noah knows every switch, every bolt, and every reason this light matters. He'll carry it forward with steadier hands than mine. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it contained more than words. Maybe the whole season of struggle and grace pressed into ink. Noah appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. You still working? Calvin smiled, just saying thank you. For what? He looked toward the tower through the open door, its beacon turning slow and constant across the water. For everyone who didn't give up, he said. Including us. The crowd gathered on the bluff just before dusk, the air full of sea salt and anticipation. Folding chairs lined the gravel path, and someone had hung a banner that read, Mariner's Point Light, Reborn. The last of the paint still smelled faintly fresh. Calvin stood near the base, adjusting the collar of his shirt as people filled the space. Town officials, neighbors, fishermen, students who'd helped rebuild. He wasn't one for speeches, but everyone kept telling him he had to say something. May handled introductions, her voice carrying clear and calm. Tonight isn't about money or luck, she said. It's about work that outlasts rumor. It's about a family that showed us what staying power looks like. She smiled toward Calvin and Noah, motioning them forward. Calvin stepped up, then hesitated. He'd built this place with his hands, but finding words always felt harder than fixing stone. Before he could begin, Noah tugged lightly on his sleeve. Can I say something? He whispered. Calvin blinked, surprised, then nodded. Go ahead. Noah walked to the small microphone. The crowd quieted, the wind brushing through jackets and hair. He looked smaller than the moment, but his voice came out steady. When we started fixing the lighthouse, he said, people said it was just a broken thing. They were kind of right. It was cracked and rusty and leaning, and sometimes it scared me to even go inside. But my dad kept saying it wasn't about fixing metal, it was about remembering what light was for. He paused, glancing at his father, who stood motionless beside him. We didn't really find treasure, Noah went on. Not the kind people talk about. We found work that mattered. We found a way to turn the light back toward people, and maybe that's better than gold. For a long second, no one moved. The ocean filled the silence with its slow rhythm. A gull called somewhere out over the water. Then someone started to clap, soft at first, then louder, spreading through the crowd until it rolled like a wave breaking. Calvin felt his throat tighten. He rested a hand on Noah's shoulder, steady but proud. May stood off to the side, wiping at her eyes without shame. Jonas gave a small, knowing nod, like a man who'd seen enough tides to understand what kind of work lasted. When the applause finally quieted, Calvin leaned toward his son and said, "You just said everything I couldn't." Noah smiled, a little embarrassed, and stepped back as the town's electrician pulled the main switch. The light at the top of the tower flared to life, steady, clear, sweeping across the darkening sky. Its beam reached far out over the waves, cutting through mist and cloud. People stood in silence, faces lit by the rotation. For the first time in generations, Mariner's point light was whole again. Calvin looked upward, then down at Noah. "There it is," he said softly. "Proof we didn't imagine it." The boy grinned. "Told you it would shine." The horizon was still half dark when Calvin stepped onto the catwalk. The boards creaked under his boots, damp with sea mist. Below, the water lay calm. No wind, no roar, only the slow breath of the tide. The world felt paused between night and morning, caught in that soft hush before the first sound of day. The lantern room glowed behind him, its restored lens turning slow and sure. Each sweep of light painted the sea in pale gold, the reflection rolling outward until it faded into the gray. Calvin leaned against the railing, hands rough and nicked, the smell of salt and paint still clinging to his sleeves. He had spent so many nights here, measuring, patching, cursing the stubbornness of old metal. Now there was nothing left to fix. The tower worked again, as it once had, not as a monument, but as a living thing. Down on the bluff, the workshop sat quiet. The new planks on the dock gleamed faintly where dew gathered. Inside, he knew, were the tools they'd built with, the hammers, sanders, coils of wire, and the marks of all the hands that had helped. Even the laughter of those kids seemed folded into the place somehow, like warmth sealed in wood. He took a slow breath, the air sharp and clean. The beam swept past his face again, steady, no flicker. It moved with the patience of something that had waited a lifetime to return. Noah's voice came from below. "Dad?" Calvin looked down. His son stood at the base of the stairs, wrapped in a blanket, hair messy from sleep. "You're up early," Calvin said. "Didn't want to miss it," Noah answered. He climbed halfway, stopping to look through the glass. "It's really working." "Yeah," Calvin said quietly. "It's working." They watched together as the light crossed the water one last time before the sun began to rise. The horizon caught fire in slow color, orange, then gold, then full daylight. The lamp dimmed against it, no longer needed, but still turning. Noah leaned on the rail. "What happens now?" Calvin smiled faintly. "Now we keep it running. That's the work, making sure it never goes dark again." The boy nodded, content with that answer. He stayed a moment longer, then headed back down toward the warmth of the house. Calvin lingered. The gulls began to wake, circling above the quiet shore. From this height, the town looked small, softened by distance. He could almost believe the years ahead would be easier, though he knew better. Work never ended, it only changed shape. He touched the lantern's frame once more, the metal cool beneath his fingers. "You're steady now," he said under his breath. "Let's keep it that way." The beam turned again, crossing his face before sweeping out to sea. Calvin stood there until the sun climbed higher, until the light of the tower faded into day, and what remained was simple and clear. A man, his hands, and a horizon wide enough for both. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe and comment to support us. See you next video.